more safe. They hurt our economy, they hurt our country, they limit our ability to speak and think and live and be creative, to have relationships, to associate freely. And they're going, this doesn't make us more safe, it makes us less safe. It puts us at risk of coming into conflict with our own government. And there's a far cry between legal programs, legitimate spying, legitimate law enforcement, where it's targeted, it's based on reasonable suspicion, an individualized suspicion, and a warranted action, and sort of dragnet mass surveillance that puts entire populations under sort of an eye that sees everything, even when it's not needed.
Want to support. And we should have mechanisms to understand how these companies are operating, the kind of decisions they are making, and the social costs that are being created as a consequence of their operations. Just as oil companies are starting to face criticism, protest, and divestment of investments as a result of the impact of their industry on our global climate, we should have the same understanding of the consequences of these companies' operation on our digital climate. But right now, it's too opaque. We don't see how these things are operating, and it makes it difficult to say who are the good guys and the bad guys. And I think that has to change.
Yeah. So, but that links me really to go back to the US election. What would you say is the role of Facebook and Google in how, not maybe the results, but the whole change of media landscape and the different players that we have at hand when making decision on, for example, choosing a president?
I think, you know, I've spoken about this one before, and the way that I went at it was I said, look, if bad posts on Facebook or Twitter or Google can change the results of our election, that's a sad indictment of our democracy, even more so than it is of Facebook or Google. That doesn't mean that these companies shouldn't be concerned. I don't think we want private companies in a position to decide what kind of speech is permissible and what kind of speech is not permissible in an open global society. Because if Facebook is making intentional decisions about, nope, we don't want people seeing this story, or nope, we don't want people seeing that story, that's a precedent that can get out of hand very quickly. They might be using it in a beneficial way. To protect us from fake news today. But what about next year? What about in 5 years? What about in 10 years? They start to shape our understanding of the world in a very dangerous way. Whereas if it's our friends who are posting these articles, we have somebody to hold to a personal account there, and somebody who has just a normal level of influence. They're not enjoying special powers or privilege or status. But it is a real problem, and this is a difficult question to answer. But I think realistically here, we need to understand what the values of these systems are, what the values of these companies are, and to make sure that it is not governments that are telling them we get to make the rules about what gets shown and what doesn't get shown, because government censorship is even a greater danger than many other structures of power, such as corporations, because as powerful as corporations are, and they are a very real threat, there are alternatives. You can go to competitors. But this is one of those central questions that I think is yet unanswered, is when fake news, when facts that are simply not real, that are made up, but feel right, have become more powerful and more persuasive than our actual reality. What does that mean about our civil culture and our appreciation for real knowledge, meaningful analysis, and ultimately our belief in basic matters of science, which is that all things should be tested, and that which can be asserted without evidence can and should be dismissed without evidence.
So, but what resources do you see that could battle that? Are we talking about competence? Do you see any other players here? Libraries? Or what do you see ahead?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a very complex space. One of the central things is we have to be aware that these things are actually happening, that it's not speculation, that it's not conspiracy. And this is what we saw in 2013. This is the reason so much of the internet had this soft, exposed underbelly that was so vulnerable to surveillance. Was if you went out in the public and you said that every communication from every person in the world that crossed U.S. lines was being collected and stored and traded around like baseball cards with all of these other countries, even if the government knew it was unlawful to engage in these activities, they'd look at you like you were crazy. There were experts, of course, who knew this was technically possible, but they couldn't prove that it was actually happening. And the distance there between speculation, between suspicion that it could happen, and fact, having proof that it actually had happened, changed the conversation. It changed the internet, and in at least a small way, but a meaningful way, it changed our politics. And I think this is very much the same. When we start to see that these fake narratives actually have a real impact, we become more aware and more armored against them. We become a little bit more skeptical. We require a higher standard of evidence, and this is a beneficial thing. But you mentioned libraries there, and I think that's actually a critical role that we haven't thought about that much. The library system in many countries around the world has been searching for purpose when information has become much more easily shareable, when it has been much more easily tradable. But we can think of librarians as a professional class that are dedicated to the ascertainment of facts, the familiarity of facts. And it would be helpful if we had more public voices and more public institutions that could weigh in a nonpartisan, apolitical way, but help us understand where the resources are and what the facts are that allow us to actually resolve these controversies in a fair way.
What is very clear when listening to you is that, and I think that's so inspiring to hear here as well, is the fact that there are so many professions that need to step up to the game and see what is their role, as well as we as individuals when using these services. So I will let the US election go, but I do know that we still need to ask one question, and that is the fact how your views are on how it will affect your own situation. Is that something you will comment on?
I don't care. The reality here is that yes, Donald Trump has appointed a new director of the Central Intelligence Agency who used me as a specific example to say that, look, dissidents should be put to death. And I think that's a fundamentally un-American thing. But we have much bigger problems than my personal situation. I am the least important part of any of this. My effort to contribute to society had the most impact, I think few would argue, in years prior. I will continue to try to contribute to the best of my ability, but if I get hit by a bus or a drone or dropped out of an airplane tomorrow, you know what, it doesn't actually matter that much to me, because I believe in the decisions that I've already made. I've done my best. I will continue to do my best. And I will not be afraid of these kind of policies that fail to understand the most basic truth of any democracy, which is that dissent is patriotic. It's not treason.
I let them applaud you. So you feel our warmth from here. But let's go back then. When you decided to blow the whistle, you choose to turn to journalists. Why?
Yes. I was concerned about my own political biases because when I was thinking about how we got here, again, sort of the original sin that led us to this series of mistakes, it was that we didn't have enough voices in the room. And when I was making these decisions, when I came to the belief that these programs were actually a violation of human rights, they were against American values, and they had violated not only the laws of the United States, but the Constitution of the United States, that this was an opinion of one. I went to colleagues, co-workers, I went to my bosses, and I showed them evidence of these programs and said, do you think this is right? And of course they went, you know, no, but that's not really our place. And I think in a way they were right. It's not the place of any one person alone to make these decisions, because they could be wrong. I could have been wrong. But that doesn't mean that you're silent. What that means is that you try to construct the same system of checks and balances that's supposed to keep our government upright, to keep us as individuals, even as dissidents, to the same standard of accountability. And so rather than acting on my own and publishing information on the internet directly, which I've been criticized for, and it's fair to say, right, this individual's acting as a gatekeeper, they're not sharing everything the public should decide, it's a fair criticism. But I believed personally that some of this information was legitimately classified, but it did also need to be considered in understanding how the operations of all these programs work, where the line was between permissible and impermissible. And so I worked with journalists to remove my own personal political biases from the equation, to mitigate the possibility that I could have simply been wrong or too radical, because this is the role of a free press in an open society, to contest the government's monopoly on the control and dissemination of information about their activities, and to ultimately measure the balance of equities in those hard questions where maybe it's close about should the public